10. The Mother Superior of St. Helena's, who starved penitent girls to purify their souls. The Fast that Killed Louisiana, 1859. The autumn rain fell like needles against the tall windows of St. Helena's Home for Wayward Girls, located on the outskirts of New Orleans, Louisiana. The year was 1859, and the Mississippi River churned with brown water just beyond the iron gates that separated the institution from the rest of the world. The gates themselves were wrought iron, painted black, topped with spikes that looked less like decoration and more like weapons designed to keep the occupants inside rather than intruders outside. Beyond those gates, the city of New Orleans pulsed with life. Commerce flowed through its streets, music drifted from taverns and theaters, steamboats bellowed their arrival at the docks, and people moved freely through their days with the kind of casual liberty that the girls inside St. Helena's could barely remember. The contrast was stark and cruel. Freedom existed mere yards away, visible through the windows, audible in the distant sounds of the city, yet entirely unreachable for those trapped within the institution's walls. Inside those gates, 17 young women between the ages of 14 and 19 lived under the strict governance of Mother Superior Constance Beaumont, a woman whose gaunt face and hollow eyes had become synonymous with discipline and divine righteousness. The building itself was a former plantation house, purchased by the Catholic diocese in 1847 and converted into an institution for the reform of young women deemed morally corrupted by society. Its Georgian architecture spoke of former grandeur, but decades of institutional use had stripped away whatever warmth the structure might once have possessed. The walls were painted a sickly grey-green color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The floors were bare wood, scuffed and stained from years of footsteps and scrubbing. The furniture was sparse and utilitarian, designed for durability rather than comfort. Every chair was hard, every bed narrow, every surface cold to the touch, even in the humid Louisiana heat. 16-year-old Margaret Sullivan pressed her face against the cold glass of the dormitory window, watching the free people of New Orleans walk along the distant levee. Her breath fogged the window, and she traced patterns in the condensation with her fingertip, drawing shapes that might have been letters or might have been nothing at all. She had been at St. Helena's for 8 months, sent there by her wealthy father after she'd been caught kissing the gardener's son behind the family estate. It had been a single kiss, brief and innocent, but her father had treated it as evidence of fundamental moral corruption, requiring immediate intervention. He had delivered her to Mother Superior personally, paying a substantial sum for her care and reformation, never suspecting that he was essentially selling his daughter into a slow death disguised as salvation. Margaret's stomach growled painfully, a sound that had become constant in recent weeks. The hunger was no longer acute pangs, but a dull, consuming ache that never left her, not even in sleep. Her dreams had become strange and vivid, filled with images of food so real she could taste them, only to wake to the crushing disappointment of her empty stomach and the knowledge that relief would not come. Mother Superior had instituted what she called the purification fast 3 months earlier, claiming that the girl's sins could only be absolved through physical suffering that mirrored Christ's sacrifice in the desert and on the cross. She spoke of this fast with the fervor of divine revelation, as though God himself had whispered the instructions directly into her ear during her nightly prayers. The once generous meals had been reduced to thin broth twice daily, supplemented occasionally by a single piece of bread so hard it could barely be chewed without risking broken teeth. Margaret's collarbone now protruded sharply beneath her grey institutional dress, creating shadows that made her look skeletal in the dim light. Her monthly cycle had stopped entirely 2 months ago, which Mother Superior had proclaimed as evidence that the purification process was working. that Margaret's body was transcending its base female nature and approaching a more pure, spiritual state. Margaret knew this was nonsense, that the absence of her cycle was simply her body shutting down non-essential functions to preserve what little energy remained. But contradicting Mother Superior on any point was forbidden and heavily punished. She was not alone in her suffering. Around her, the other girls moved like ghosts through the dim corridors, their eyes sunken deep in their skulls. Their movements slow and deliberate to conserve what little energy their starving bodies could produce. They had stopped talking much, conversation requiring calories they could not spare. The silence in St. Helena's had become oppressive, broken only by Mother Superior's voice during prayers and lectures, the shuffle of feet on wooden floors, and the occasional muffled sob from a girl too exhausted to cry properly, but too desperate to stop trying. The girls' names and stories were diverse, but their current condition was uniformly tragic. There was Sarah Chen, 18 years old, sent to St. Helena's because her Chinese mother and Irish father's marriage scandalized New Orleans society, and Sarah's independent spirit scandalized it further. There was Rebecca Williams, 15, who had been caught reading books deemed inappropriate for young ladies, books about science and politics rather than domestic arts and proper feminine behavior. There was Catherine Brennan, just 14, the youngest of them all, who had committed the sin of being too pretty and attracting attention she neither sought nor wanted from men her father's age. Her father, fearing for her reputation, or perhaps simply tired of defending her innocence, had sent her to St. Helena's to be protected from herself. Each girl had arrived at the institution with her own story of alleged moral failing, and each had discovered that Mother Superior viewed them all as equally corrupted vessels requiring the same harsh treatment to achieve purification. The specific sins that had brought them here mattered less than Mother Superior's conviction that all young women were inherently prone to wickedness and required constant vigilance and correction to prevent their natural inclinations toward corruption from manifesting. Sister Agnes, one of the younger nuns who assisted Mother Superior, had initially protested the severity of the fasting regime. Margaret had overheard a heated conversation between Sister Agnes and Mother Beaumont in the chapel 3 weeks earlier. Sister Agnes's voice had trembled as she spoke, but her words had been clear and urgent, carrying through the quiet building with the desperation of someone watching a terrible mistake unfold in slow motion. Mother Superior, I beg you to reconsider. Young Catherine fainted during prayers this morning, and this is the 3rd time in as many days. Her lips are turning blue, and she can barely stand without assistance. I fear for her life and for the lives of all these children. These are not hardened sinners we are dealing with. Most of them are guilty of nothing more than being young and spirited in a world that demands absolute compliance from females. Surely our Lord would not demand such sacrifice from them. Surely there are other ways to guide them toward righteousness that do not involve destroying their bodies in the name of saving their souls. Mother Beaumont's response had been cold and measured, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who believed themselves to be an instrument of divine will, chosen by God for this specific purpose, and therefore incapable of error. Sister Agnes, you forget yourself and you forget your place in this institution. These girls are not innocent children, no matter what their ages might suggest. They are vessels of corruption who came to us stained with sin, tainted by their willfulness and their refusal to accept the proper submissive role that God designed for their sex. Catherine's weakness is merely the physical manifestation of her spiritual impurity leaving her body. When she is truly cleansed, when the corruption has been purged completely, she will be strong again, stronger than she ever was before because she will be pure. Your doubt is itself a form of sin, a questioning of divine wisdom, and I will pray for your soul tonight and every night until you understand the sacred nature of the work we do here. Sister Agnes had not raised the issue again, at least not within Margaret's hearing, and certainly not in Mother Superior's presence. Instead, the young nun had taken to sneaking small portions of her own meager rations to the girls, when Mother Superior was occupied with her private devotions, or when she was locked away in her personal chambers, where none of the other sisters were permitted to enter. It was never enough to satisfy hunger or even to prevent the ongoing deterioration of their bodies, but the gesture represented something more valuable than food. It represented proof that not everyone in authority had abandoned their humanity, that somewhere beneath the layers of religious obedience and institutional hierarchy, there remained a human being capable of recognizing suffering and wanting to alleviate it even at personal risk. Margaret turned from the window as the dinner bell rang, its sound echoing through the stone corridors like the toll of a funeral bell. The sound used to bring relief and anticipation, a promise of sustenance and a brief respite from hunger. Now it only heralded another bowl of watery broth that mocked their hunger rather than satisfied it, a cruel reminder of what food should be and what they were actually receiving. She joined the silent procession of girls, making their way down the stone staircase to the refectory, their footsteps echoing in the cold hallway. Margaret noticed that several of the younger girls were supporting each other, too weak to walk independently, their thin arms wrapped around each other's waists, keeping each other upright through sheer collective will. The refectory was a large room with high ceilings and religious imagery covering every wall. Portraits of saints looked down with expressions that Margaret had once interpreted as benevolent, but now saw as judgmental and cold. A massive wooden crucifix dominated the space above Mother Superior's chair at the head of the long table, Jesus' suffering face frozen in eternal agony, his emaciated body serving as a constant reminder of the virtue Mother Superior claimed to find in physical suffering. The girls took their assigned seats in silence, their hands folded in their laps as they had been trained to do, backs straight despite exhaustion, eyes downcast in the posture of submission that Mother Superior demanded at all times. Mother Beaumont entered the room last, her black habit rustling as she moved, with the deliberate grace of someone performing a sacred ritual rather than simply walking to a chair. Mother Superior was 47 years old. Though her severe lifestyle made her appear both ageless and ancient simultaneously, as though she existed outside normal time. Her face was all sharp angles and tight skin stretched over prominent bones. Her eyes were the pale grey of dirty ice, and they swept across the assembled girls with an intensity that made Margaret feel exposed and judged, as though Mother Superior could see into her soul and was cataloguing every impure thought, every moment of doubt, every flash of resistance. When Mother Beaumont spoke, her voice filled the room despite its measured tone, the acoustics of the space amplifying her words until they seemed to come from everywhere at once. Let us give thanks for the sustenance we are about to receive and for the opportunity to purify our bodies and souls through sacrifice. Each hunger pang you feel is another sin being burned away by the holy fire of deprivation. Each moment of weakness you overcome is a step closer to the righteousness that has eluded you throughout your corrupted lives. Remember that your suffering has meaning and purpose. You are not victims of cruel treatment. You are pilgrims on a journey towards salvation, and the road to heaven has always been paved with suffering and sacrifice. The saints suffered. Christ himself suffered. And so you must suffer if you wish to be worthy of God's love and forgiveness. The girls murmured their dutiful responses, though several voices wavered with weakness, and at least 2 girls could barely produce sound at all, their vocal cords as depleted as the rest of their bodies. Young Catherine, who Sister Agnes had mentioned in her futile protest, sat 3 places down from Margaret. The 14-year-old's skin had taken on a greyish pallor that reminded Margaret of corpses she had seen at funerals, that particular shade of not-quite life that bodies assumed in the hours after death. Catherine's hands shook visibly as she reached for her spoon, the tremor so severe that Margaret wondered if the girl would be able to lift the utensil to her mouth without spilling the precious liquid it contained. Margaret caught Catherine's eye and offered a small, encouraging smile, trying to convey solidarity and hope in that brief expression. Catherine tried to return it, but the expression dissolved into something closer to a grimace of pain, her face contorting as though even the effort of smiling required more energy than she possessed. The broth was served by Sister Agnes and two other silent nuns who moved efficiently around the table, their faces carefully blank, revealing nothing of what they thought or felt about the suffering they witnessed daily. When Margaret's bowl was placed before her, she could see to the bottom through the thin liquid, the ceramic pattern on the bowl clearly visible through the supposedly nourishing soup. A few small pieces of turnip floated in the watery substance, grey and soft with overcooking, and that was all. No meat, no fat, no substance that might actually provide calories sufficient to sustain a growing young woman. Margaret had learned to eat slowly, letting each spoonful rest in her mouth for as long as possible before swallowing, feeling the warmth spread briefly through her chest before disappearing. It created the illusion of a larger meal and made the meager portions last longer, turned 5 minutes of eating into 15 minutes of at least having something in her mouth. Mother Superior watched them eat with the focused attention of a scientist observing an experiment, taking notes in a leather-bound journal that she kept at her place at the table. She wrote observations about each girl's condition, Margaret had learned, documenting their weight loss, their physical symptoms, their level of compliance with institutional rules. This journal, Mother Superior had explained during one of her lectures, would serve as proof of the purification process, demonstrating through careful documentation how physical deprivation led to spiritual transformation. Margaret suspected the journal served a different purpose, providing Mother Superior with a record she could use to justify her treatment of the girls, if questions were ever raised by their families or by church authorities. Mother Superior ate nothing herself during these communal meals, claiming that her own fasting was more severe than what she required of the girls, that she was setting an example through her own deprivation. Margaret had noticed, however, that Mother Beaumont's physical condition did not seem to deteriorate the way theirs did. The older woman remained strong and energetic while the girls grew weaker by the day. Her movements were quick and purposeful while theirs became sluggish and labored. Her skin maintained its color and elasticity while theirs became sallow and loose. It suggested that Mother Superior was eating privately in her locked chambers, maintaining her strength through secret meals while demanding sacrifices from those under her care. The hypocrisy was obvious, but impossible to challenge without proof, and none of the girls had access to Mother Superior's private spaces. As Margaret forced down the tasteless broth, she thought about freedom. Not the abstract concept taught in Sunday sermons about spiritual liberation and salvation, but the tangible reality of walking through an open door without permission, of eating when hungry without being told it was a sin to want sustenance, of making choices about her own body and life without every decision being filtered through someone else's interpretation of divine will. Her father had sent her to St. Helena's to be reformed, to have her willfulness broken and replaced with proper feminine submission and docility. He had no idea that the institution he had trusted with his daughter's care was slowly killing her through systematic starvation masked as spiritual discipline. He probably imagined she was learning to embroider and practice piano, to walk with books balanced on her head and speak only when spoken to. All the things wealthy New Orleans society deemed appropriate for young ladies of her class. After the meal, which lasted barely 10 minutes despite Margaret's efforts to stretch it longer, the girls were led to the chapel for evening prayers. This was Mother Superior's favorite time of day, when she could hold them captive for hours of repetitive devotions that left their knees bruised and their minds numb with exhaustion and the constant repetition of prayers they had long since stopped understanding or believing. The chapel was even colder than the refectory, with draughts that came through gaps around the tall windows, carrying the damp chill of the Louisiana autumn evening. Margaret knelt on the hard stone floor and tried to focus on the prayer, but her mind kept wandering to thoughts of escape, to plans and possibilities that seemed increasingly urgent as her body continued to fail. The problem was not the physical barriers to escape. The gates were locked, certainly, but Margaret was clever and determined enough that she could probably find a way through them or over them if she chose to try. The real prison was psychological, the carefully constructed system of control that Mother Beaumont had spent months implementing. Mother Superior had broken down each girl's sense of self, convincing them that they were inherently corrupt and that only complete submission to her authority could save them from eternal damnation. She had isolated them from their families, controlling all correspondence that went in or out of St. Helena's, reading every letter they wrote and every letter they received, censoring anything that might encourage resistance or foster doubt about the righteousness of her methods. She had created an environment where questioning her methods was presented as evidence of continued sinfulness, where any expression of doubt or resistance was interpreted as proof that the girl in question required even more severe treatment to break through her spiritual corruption. It was a closed system, perfectly designed to perpetuate itself, with no possibility of appeal or outside intervention, because the outside world had no idea what was actually happening behind the locked gates of St. Helena's. But Margaret had begun to see through the manipulation, and the clarity had come paradoxically from her hunger. As her body weakened, certain non-essential mental processes had shut down. The social conditioning that told her to be compliant and pleasant, the instinct to seek approval from authority figures, the assumption that adults in positions of power generally had her best interests at heart. All of these things had faded as her brain devoted its limited resources to survival rather than social performance. What remained was a sharp, clear understanding of her situation. She was being harmed deliberately by someone who enjoyed having power over helpless people. The religious justifications were lies. The talk of purification and salvation was manipulation. Mother Superior was not a holy woman following divine guidance. She was a cruel person who had found a socially acceptable outlet for her cruelty. Margaret understood now that Mother Superior's power existed only because they collectively allowed it to exist. If enough girls refused to cooperate, if enough voices said no simultaneously, the entire system would collapse like a house of cards. Mother Beaumont was one woman. They were 17. Even in their weakened condition, they outnumbered her. The challenge was convincing the others to take that risk, when they had been conditioned to believe that disobedience would damn their eternal souls, and when they were too weak to think clearly through the fog of starvation. That night, after lights out, Margaret lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the dormitory. Several girls were crying softly into their thin pillows, the sound barely audible but unmistakable to anyone listening for it. One was praying in desperate whispers, her voice catching on words that might have been pleas for divine intervention or simply expressions of pain. Another was coughing with a wet, rattling sound that suggested her body was beginning to fail in more serious ways, that malnutrition was transitioning into something more immediately dangerous. Margaret made a decision then, a conscious choice that felt like the first real decision she had made in months. She would not wait to be rescued by parents who did not know she needed rescuing. She would not passively accept this slow death disguised as salvation. She would find a way to expose what was happening at St. Helena's, and she would do it before more girls suffered permanent damage or worse. The next morning began like every other morning in the institution, a monotonous routine that had been carefully designed to break the spirit through sheer repetitive boredom. The girls rose at dawn, when Sister Agnes rang the bell that hung outside the dormitory door. They washed in cold water from the basin in the corner of the room, taking turns because there was only one basin for 17 girls, and Mother Superior did not believe in wasting resources on comfort or convenience. They dressed in their identical grey institutional dresses, which hung loose on their diminishing frames like shrouds. They assembled in the hallway in perfect silence, standing in a straight line in order of height, because Mother Superior believed that order and regularity in external behavior would promote order and regularity in internal character. Breakfast was a repeat of dinner, another bowl of thin broth that insulted their hunger rather than addressing it. Margaret noticed immediately that Catherine did not come down for the meal, and a cold dread settled into her chest. When she quietly asked the girl who slept in the bed next to Catherine's what had happened, the response was whispered and frightened, the words barely audible. She could not stand this morning. Her legs would not support her weight. Sister Agnes is with her now in the infirmary, but Mother Superior said that medical intervention would interfere with the purification process. She has forbidden Sister Agnes from sending for a doctor. She says that Catherine's crisis is spiritual and that only prayer can help her now. Margaret felt rage rising in her chest, hot and fierce despite her physical weakness, despite the cold that had settled into her bones and seemed to leach away all capacity for strong emotion. This was not divine will unfolding. This was murder dressed up in religious language, and everyone in the building knew it, even if they would not admit it out loud. Catherine was dying because she had been systematically starved by a woman who used God as justification for her cruelty, and they were all being forced to participate in the charade by acting as though this was somehow normal and acceptable. Mother Superior seemed unconcerned by Catherine's absence from breakfast. She led morning prayers with her usual fervor, her voice rising and falling in practiced cadences that had once seemed holy but now sounded to Margaret like the mechanical repetitions of someone performing a memorized script, rather than communicating genuine faith or devotion. After prayers, the girls were divided into work groups for their daily duties, the physical labor that kept St. Helena's functioning, and also, not coincidentally, exhausted them further and prevented them from having energy for resistance or escape attempts. Margaret was assigned to the laundry, a brutally physical task that required carrying heavy baskets of wet linens up and down stairs, spending hours scrubbing stains from institutional sheets with harsh lye soap that dried out and cracked their hands, and standing over boiling pots of water in a room that was insufferably hot, regardless of the weather outside. The work would have been difficult for well-fed, healthy young women. For girls in their condition, it was torture. The laundry room was in the basement of the building, a damp space lit by small windows near the ceiling that allowed glimpses of the outside world, distant and unreachable. Margaret worked alongside 4 other girls, none of them with enough energy for conversation, all of them focused entirely on completing their tasks without collapsing. The work was mechanical and mind-numbing, which gave Margaret time to think and plan. She needed to get a message out of St. Helena's, but all correspondence was screened by Mother Superior. She needed proof of what was happening, but the evidence was written on their starving bodies, and those bodies were hidden behind locked gates. She needed someone on the outside to care enough to investigate. But wealthy New Orleans families who sent their daughters to institutions like this, one generally did so precisely because they did not want to think too much about what happened to those daughters, as long as they were returned eventually as properly submissive and compliant women. Around mid-morning, Sister Agnes came to the laundry room, carrying a basket of soiled linens. She set it down near Margaret and leaned in close, her voice barely audible above the sound of scrubbing and water sloshing. "Catherine is very ill. Her pulse is weak and irregular, and she is delirious with fever. I have sent for a doctor despite Mother Superior's prohibition, but I fear he may not arrive in time. Margaret, I do not know what to do. I am frightened for all of you. For Catherine most immediately, but for all of you in time if this continues. I have tried to reason with Mother Superior, but she will not listen. She believes absolutely in the righteousness of what she is doing. She genuinely thinks she is saving your souls, even as she destroys your bodies. Margaret looked up at the young nun, seeing her own fear reflected back in Sister Agnes's eyes. The nun was perhaps 25 years old, with a kind face that showed signs of her own inadequate diet and the stress of witnessing suffering she was powerless to prevent. She was not the enemy here, just another prisoner in a different kind of cage, constrained by vows of obedience and the hierarchical structure of the religious order that kept her subordinate to Mother Superior's authority. "Sister, we need help from outside these walls. Is there anyone you can contact? Anyone who would believe what is happening here and have the power to intervene?" Sister Agnes glanced nervously toward the doorway, checking to ensure no one was listening, then turned back to Margaret with an expression of desperate hope mixed with terror. "There is Father O'Brien at St. Joseph's Church in the city. He is a good man, genuinely devoted to the welfare of his parishioners rather than to maintaining institutional power. He is not like some of the clergy who look the other way when institutions abuse their authority because challenging that authority might threaten the church's reputation or funding. But I have no way to reach him without Mother Superior discovering the communication. All correspondence is monitored, and I am not permitted to leave the grounds without explicit permission for specific purposes." Margaret thought quickly, her hunger-sharpened mind cutting through unnecessary complications to find the simplest solution. What if you claimed you needed to go to confession? You could leave the grounds for a legitimate religious purpose that Mother Superior could not refuse, without appearing impious herself. She makes such a show of piety and devotion that she could hardly deny you the sacrament of confession without contradicting everything she claims to believe about the importance of spiritual care. Sister Agnes's eyes widened with a mixture of hope and fear, the competing emotions visible in her expression. "It would be dangerous for me personally. If she discovered my true purpose, I would be dismissed from the order, and I have nowhere else to go. But you are right, that something must be done. I cannot stand by and watch children die while pretending this is God's will. I will attempt it tomorrow morning. I will tell Mother Superior that I am experiencing a spiritual crisis and need to confess to Father O'Brien specifically, because I knew him before I entered this order and trust him to understand my particular struggles." The nun hurried away before anyone could notice their extended conversation, her habit rustling as she climbed the stairs out of the basement laundry. Margaret returned to her scrubbing with renewed purpose coursing through her despite her physical exhaustion. Help was coming, or at least the possibility of help existed. They only needed to survive a little longer, to keep their bodies functioning long enough for someone with actual power to intervene and stop what was happening at St. Helena's. But survival was becoming increasingly difficult with each passing day. That evening, Catherine did not appear for dinner, and whispers spread through the refectory that the young girl was delirious with fever and calling out for her mother in between periods of unconsciousness. Mother Superior acknowledged the situation with cold pragmatism during her pre-meal prayer, framing Catherine's approaching death as a spiritual event rather than the direct result of her own policies. Catherine Brennan is undergoing a spiritual crisis. Her body is fighting the purification process because her soul is still weighted with sin, accumulated during her 14 years of life. We will pray for her with great fervor, but we will not interfere with divine will through the intervention of secular medicine. If it is God's plan to call her home to receive her judgment, then we must accept that with humility and grace. Her death, if it comes, will serve as a lesson to all of you about the seriousness of sin and the necessity of complete submission to God's purifying fire. Margaret felt rage rising in her chest, hot and fierce and almost overwhelming in its intensity. This was not divine will unfolding according to some cosmic plan. This was murder, plain and simple, dressed up in religious language and justified through twisted interpretations of Scripture. Catherine was dying because she had been systematically starved by a woman who used God as justification for her cruelty and her desire for power over helpless people. Margaret wanted to stand up and shout the truth, to force everyone in the room to acknowledge what they all knew, but were too frightened or brainwashed to confront directly. But screaming would accomplish nothing except getting her locked in the isolation room, a windowless cell in the basement where girls were sent for punishment, left alone in complete darkness for days with even less food than they normally received. She needed to be strategic rather than emotional. She needed to wait for Sister Agnes to reach Father O'Brien. She needed to keep herself and the others alive until help arrived, which meant maintaining at least the appearance of compliance while building resistance beneath the surface. After dinner, instead of going to the chapel for evening prayers, as was the usual routine, Mother Superior made an announcement that sent a ripple of exhausted despair through the assembled girls. Tonight, we will hold a special vigil for Catherine. We will pray through the entire night for her soul, asking God to grant her the strength to complete her purification or the mercy to end her suffering quickly if she cannot be saved. All of you will participate in this vigil. There will be no sleep until dawn breaks and reveals God's will for Catherine's fate. The girls exchanged exhausted glances, their eyes communicating what their voices could not. An all-night vigil in their weakened condition would be torture, pure and simple. Several would likely collapse before morning, and the rest would be so exhausted that the next day's work would be nearly impossible to complete. But no one dared protest. They had learned through bitter experience that questioning Mother Superior's decisions only brought more severe punishment and accomplished nothing in terms of changing her mind. They filed silently into the chapel and took their places on the hard stone floor, preparing for a night of suffering disguised as devotion. Mother Superior led them through prayer after prayer, hymn after hymn, reading after reading from Scripture that she interpreted in ways that justified her cruelty. The candles burned down and were replaced by Sister Agnes, who moved through the chapel like a ghost, her face showing the strain of knowing that everything happening here was wrong, but being powerless to stop it through any legitimate channels. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Margaret's knees went numb from kneeling on stone, then began to throb with pain that shot up her legs and settled into her lower back. Her head swam with dizziness from hunger and exhaustion combined. Around her, girls were weeping openly, and at least 3 had already fainted and been revived with splashes of cold water that did nothing to address the underlying causes of their collapse. Around 3 in the morning, when the darkness outside the chapel windows was absolute and the candles cast dancing shadows on the walls that made the religious imagery seem to move and writhe, a sound penetrated the monotonous drone of prayers. It was a scream, high and agonized, and utterly terrifying in its intensity, coming from somewhere above them in the main building. The girls froze in their prayers, and even Mother Superior paused in her recitation, though her expression remained cold and unmoved. "That is Catherine's mortal pain leaving her body," Mother Superior said calmly, as though discussing a mildly interesting weather phenomenon rather than the death agonies of a 14-year-old child. "Continue praying with renewed fervor. Her suffering is nearly complete, and we must ensure that her soul receives proper guidance during this final transition from corrupt flesh to purified spirit." But the scream came again, And this time Margaret recognized it as not just pain, but desperation and fear. Catherine was dying in terror, alone except for whatever nun had been assigned to watch her death rather than prevent it. And they were all kneeling in this cold chapel, forced to pretend that this was somehow holy and right, that a child's death from starvation was an example of divine will rather than human cruelty. Margaret felt something break inside her, some final thread of compliance and obedience that had been fraying for weeks. The conditioning that had kept her passive despite her growing understanding of the evil being perpetrated here finally snapped. She stood up, her legs shaking with weakness, but her voice steady with conviction. "This is wrong. Catherine is not being purified. She is being killed. We are all being killed slowly. This has nothing to do with God or righteousness or salvation. This is cruelty and abuse, pure and simple, and we do not have to accept it. We do not have to participate in our own destruction just because someone in a position of authority tells us it is for our own good." The chapel fell into shocked silence. Every eye turned to Margaret, some with fear, some with hope, some with the blank exhaustion of people too depleted to feel anything strongly. Mother Superior rose from her chair with frightening speed, crossing the distance between them in seconds with a movement that belied her claims of severe fasting. Her hand struck Margaret's face with enough force to knock her sideways, and Margaret tasted blood in her mouth where her teeth had cut her lip. "You will be silent. You will kneel immediately and pray for forgiveness for your blasphemy and your attempt to corrupt the other girls with your lies." Margaret remained standing despite the blow, despite her weakness, despite the fear that tried to push her back into compliance. She had made her decision, and there would be no going back. "No, I will not be silent anymore, and I will not kneel to you. You are not God. You are not even a good person. You are just a cruel woman who enjoys having power over people too frightened to resist you, and you use religion as justification for satisfying your desire to hurt and control." Mother Superior's face contorted with rage, all pretense of spiritual serenity evaporating to reveal the anger and need for dominance that had always lurked beneath the surface. "Sister Mary Catherine, take this girl to the isolation room immediately. She will remain there without food or water until she recants her lies and begs for absolution. If she dies there, it will be evidence that her soul was too corrupted to be saved, and that my judgment of her was correct all along." Two nuns moved forward to seize Margaret's arms with rough hands, but before they could reach her and drag her away to punishment that might well prove fatal in her weakened condition, another voice spoke up. It was Sarah Chen, the 18-year-old girl whose mixed heritage had made her an outsider in New Orleans society, whose independence had been deemed dangerous enough to require institutional correction. "Margaret is telling the truth that all of us have known, but been too frightened to speak aloud. We are being harmed here, deliberately and systematically. My older sister died in an institution like this one 3 years ago. They told my parents she died of influenza. But I know now, after experiencing this place, that she was starved to death, just like Catherine is being starved, just like all of us are being starved. I will not let it happen again. I will not be complicit in my own destruction or in the destruction of others. I stand with Margaret." Sarah stood up, her thin frame trembling, but her eyes defiant, and the simple act of standing represented a rejection of the entire system of control that Mother Superior had constructed so carefully. Then another girl stood, a quiet 16-year-old named Emma, who had barely spoken since arriving at St. Helena's 6 months earlier, and another stood, and another, like a wave spreading through the chapel. Within moments, more than half the assembled girls were on their feet, united in their refusal to continue participating in their own destruction, finding strength in numbers that none of them possessed individually. Mother Superior looked around the chapel with wild eyes, watching her absolute authority crumble before her. seeing the careful structure of fear and compliance that she had built over years collapse in minutes. Her voice rose to a shriek that echoed off the stone walls. "You will all be punished severely for this rebellion. You will learn that defying God's chosen vessel brings only suffering. You think your situation is difficult now. You cannot imagine how much worse I can make it for you. I will break every one of you before I am finished." But Margaret stepped forward, and the other standing girls moved with her, forming a unified front that represented something more powerful than any individual act of defiance. Their weakness became strength through solidarity. "You have no power over us except what we give you, and we are taking it back right now. Sister Agnes has gone for help. By tomorrow, everyone will know what happens in this place. You can try to lock us in isolation rooms. You can withhold food and water even more completely than you already have. But you cannot make us believe your lies anymore. We know the truth now, and we will speak it no matter what threats you make. We are not sinners who deserve punishment. We are prisoners who deserve freedom." The confrontation might have turned physically violent, might have escalated into something even more terrible than what was already happening, if not for a sudden pounding on the chapel doors that startled everyone into frozen silence. Father O'Brien had arrived, brought by Sister Agnes several hours earlier than anyone expected. The young nun had not waited until morning, as she had originally planned, but had fled St. Helena's as soon as darkness fell the previous evening, running through the dangerous streets of New Orleans at night to reach the priest, risking assault or worse, because the urgency of Catherine's situation would not allow for waiting until a more convenient or safer time. Together, Father O'Brien and Sister Agnes had returned with 2 police officers and a doctor, the nun having convinced them that children were in immediate danger and that every minute of delay might cost lives. The pounding on the door grew more insistent, and Mother Superior had no choice but to allow them entry or face even more serious questions about what she was hiding behind her locked gates, and why she was refusing to admit men of the cloth and law enforcement into a supposedly respectable religious institution. What followed was chaos and revelation. The carefully maintained facade of St. Helena's home for wayward girls, cracking and then shattering completely as the reality behind it was exposed to outside scrutiny. Catherine was found barely alive, her body so wasted that the doctor estimated she had perhaps hours left to live without immediate intensive medical intervention. Her pulse was thready and irregular, her breathing shallow and labored, her skin cold to the touch despite the fever that raged through her failing system. She was immediately removed to a hospital in New Orleans, carried out on a stretcher while Mother Superior protested that they were interfering with God's plan, that secular medicine had no place in spiritual purification. Catherine would die 3 days later, despite the best medical care available in the city, her body too damaged by prolonged starvation to recover even when food and fluids were finally provided. But at least she died in a hospital bed surrounded by people trying to save her, rather than in the cold infirmary of St. Helena's, with people who had deliberately starved her, watching her die, and calling it purification. The other girls were examined by the doctor and found to be in various stages of malnutrition and physical deterioration. Margaret herself had lost nearly 30 pounds from her already slender frame, bringing her to a weight so low that the doctor expressed amazement that she was still conscious and coherent. Several girls showed signs of organ damage that might prove permanent, even with proper nutrition restored. All of them had vitamin deficiencies that would require months of treatment to correct. The physical evidence of abuse was so overwhelming that even Mother Superior's protests and religious justifications could not explain it away. Mother Superior was arrested that morning and charged with child endangerment, criminal abuse, and ultimately, after Catherine died, with negligent homicide. During the investigation that followed, It was discovered that she had been embezzling significant funds meant for the girls' care, selling their labor to local businesses who were happy to get essentially free workers, and using the profits to finance a comfortable lifestyle for herself while preaching about the virtues of suffering and sacrifice. The purification fast had been partly religious obsession, but also partly a convenient way to reduce expenses and increase profits, while maintaining her public image as a strict disciplinarian devoted to spiritual transformation, rather than someone running what amounted to a for-profit prison disguised as a charitable institution. St. Helena's Home for Wayward Girls was closed permanently by order of the diocese, which was desperate to distance itself from the scandal and avoid further investigations into other institutions it operated. The remaining staff were scattered to other positions within the church, though several faced their own investigations and disciplinary proceedings. Sister Agnes, who had risked everything to bring help, was praised publicly by Father O'Brien, but dismissed from her order for disobedience to her superior. The church hierarchy was uncomfortable with the precedent of a junior nun going over her superior's head, even when that superior was later proven to be criminally abusive. Sister Agnes would later become a teacher at a public school, dedicating her life to protecting children from institutional abuse and speaking openly about what she had witnessed at St. Helena's. Margaret returned to her father's estate, where she spent months recovering her physical health under the care of doctors who were horrified by her condition. But the psychological impact of her time at St. Helena's would stay with her forever, shaping her understanding of power and authority and freedom in ways that would define the rest of her life. She had learned lessons that many people never understand or refuse to accept, even when confronted with evidence. She had learned that authority figures can lie and manipulate without remorse. She had learned that institutions can become corrupt, and that the corruption can persist for years because people assume that established institutions must be legitimate. She had learned that religious language can be used to justify terrible cruelty, that appeals to higher purposes and divine will can make abuse seem acceptable or even virtuous to those who want to believe in the righteousness of their actions. But she had also learned about courage and solidarity, about the power of speaking truth, even when doing so is terrifying, about the strength that emerges when people unite against oppression. She had learned that freedom is not given but taken, that it requires the willingness to risk safety and comfort for principle, that sometimes the only way to preserve human dignity is to refuse cooperation with systems designed to destroy it. In the years that followed, Margaret would become a prominent advocate for institutional reform, traveling throughout Louisiana and neighboring states to speak about her experiences and push for better oversight of charitable institutions that claim to serve vulnerable populations. She would face criticism and opposition from many quarters. Some people believed that girls like her deserved harsh treatment, that suffering was good for young women's souls, that questioning authority was dangerous, and that her advocacy was itself evidence of the moral corruption that had landed her in St. Helena's in the first place. But Margaret had seen the consequences of silent acceptance. She had watched Catherine Brennan die because no one intervened soon enough. She had felt her own body wasting away, while people who claimed to care for her soul stood by and allowed it to happen. She would not be silent. She would not let others suffer in darkness when she had the power to shine light on institutional abuse. The story of St. Helena's became a significant scandal that forced difficult conversations about the treatment of women and girls in religious institutions throughout the American South. Laws were passed in Louisiana and several other states requiring regular unannounced inspections of institutions that housed minors, with inspectors having the authority to examine the physical condition of residents and interview them privately. procedures were established for investigating complaints of abuse that came from within institutions, protecting whistleblowers from retaliation. Standards were set for minimum nutrition and medical care. And while these changes came too late for Catherine, and for countless others who had suffered and died in similar institutions over the years, they represented a small but meaningful step toward a world where authority would be questioned rather than blindly obeyed, and where the vulnerable would be protected rather than exploited. On the 10th anniversary of Catherine's death, Margaret stood at the girl's grave in a small cemetery outside New Orleans. The headstone read simply, "Catherine Mary Brennan, 1845-1859, beloved daughter, lost too soon." Margaret placed flowers on the grave, white lilies that reminded her of innocence and purity, but also of death and mourning, and spoke quietly as though the girl could hear her. "I never forgot you, Catherine. I've thought about you almost every day for 10 years. I never forgot what happened to you and to all of us in that terrible place. Your death meant something. It changed things in ways that matter. That does not make it right or fair. Nothing can make it right. You should have lived. You should have had the chance to grow up and fall in love and make your own choices and be free to define your own life. But because you died, because people finally saw what was being done to children in places like St. Helena's, other girls got to live. Because witnesses saw what happened to you, they could not look away from what was happening to others. Laws were changed. Institutions were reformed. Not everywhere and not completely, but it was something. I hope that is worth something. I hope that wherever you are now, if there is any kind of consciousness that survives death, you know that your suffering was not meaningless. The wind stirred the trees around the cemetery, and for a moment, Margaret felt the presence of all the girls who had not survived institutions like St. Helena's over the years and decades and centuries. They were the price paid for a society that valued control over compassion, that prioritized breaking spirits over nurturing souls, that allowed cruelty to flourish behind closed doors as long as it was dressed in the language of moral improvement and religious devotion. Their deaths stood as testament to the dangers of unchecked authority, of blind obedience to institutions, of assuming that people in positions of power always have the best interests of those under their control at heart. But their deaths had also sparked resistance and reform. Their suffering had awakened consciences and forced confrontations with uncomfortable truths about how power operates and how easily it can be abused when those who possess it are not held accountable. They had not died in vain, though they absolutely should never have died at all. And Margaret would spend the rest of her life ensuring that their deaths counted for something, that the lessons learned from their suffering would not be forgotten as soon as the scandal faded from public memory. Margaret left the cemetery as the sun began to set over the Mississippi River, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she had been in a mood to appreciate beauty rather than feeling the weight of memory and responsibility. She had a meeting that evening with a group of legislators discussing new proposals for institutional oversight, expanding the reforms that had been passed in the wake of St. Helena's scandal to cover more types of institutions and provide stronger protections for residents. She had testimony to give, stories to tell, truths to speak that might make her audience uncomfortable, but that needed to be heard regardless. The work of protecting the vulnerable and limiting the power of those who would abuse authority was never finished. It was a constant battle that had to be fought again and again, because power always sought to expand itself, and those who possessed it always developed elaborate justifications for why their particular exercise of power was necessary and beneficial regardless of how much harm it caused. As she walked through the streets of New Orleans toward the legislative building, Margaret thought about the concept of liberty that Americans claimed to hold so sacred that they celebrated in speeches and monuments and national holidays. True freedom, she had learned through bitter experience, was not just about political independence or democratic government or the abstract rights enumerated in founding documents. It was about the fundamental right of every person to control their own body, to make their own choices, to resist those who would dominate and control them, to say no to authority that exceeded its legitimate bounds, and to have that refusal respected rather than punished. The girls at St. Helena's had been American citizens, born and raised in a country that claimed liberty as its highest value, yet they had been denied the most basic freedoms. They had been imprisoned without trial, starved in the name of spiritual improvement, brutalized by people who claimed to act in their best interests. Their experiences revealed the lie at the heart of American exceptionalism, the uncomfortable truth that liberty was selectively applied and that many people remained enslaved by institutions and individuals who exercised unchecked power over their lives. Freedom was not universal. It depended on your social position, your economic resources, your gender, your race, your age, your ability to resist or escape when power was used against you. But Margaret had also learned that freedom could be seized even in the most oppressive circumstances, that resistance was possible even when it seemed hopeless. The moment when she had stood up in that chapel and refused to accept Mother Superior's authority any longer had been simultaneously the most terrifying and empowering moment of her life. She had discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear, that solidarity was stronger than any individual act of defiance, and that speaking truth could shatter systems of control that had seemed unbreakable. These were lessons worth learning regardless of the price paid to acquire them. Though Margaret would have gladly remained ignorant if it meant Catherine and the others had lived, these lessons stayed with Margaret throughout her long life. She would eventually marry, though she chose a partner who respected her independence and supported her activism rather than expecting her to abandon her work and become a conventional wife focused solely on domestic concerns. She would have children, and she would teach them to question authority, to stand up for the powerless, to never accept that suffering was noble or that cruelty could be justified by appeals to higher purposes or greater goods. She raised them to be free, in the truest sense of the word, capable of making their own choices and defending those choices against anyone who tried to override their autonomy in the name of knowing what was best for them. The story of St. Helena's home for wayward girls became a cautionary tale told in reform circles, a reminder of what happens when institutions are allowed to operate without oversight, and when vulnerable populations are placed at the mercy of individuals who prioritize control over care. But it was also a story about resistance and resilience, about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when pushed beyond their limits, and about the power of truth to challenge even the most entrenched systems of oppression. It was a story that needed to be told and retold, so that the lessons it contained would not be forgotten or dismissed as irrelevant to more modern times. Mother Constance Beaumont died in prison 7 years after her arrest, unrepentant to the very end, never acknowledging responsibility or expressing remorse. She maintained throughout her trial and imprisonment that she had been following divine guidance and that her persecution was evidence of a godless society that had lost its moral compass and rejected righteous discipline in favor of permissive softness. She went to her grave believing that she had been righteous and that history would eventually vindicate her actions once society realized the dangers of allowing young women too much freedom and autonomy. She died alone, unmourned except by a handful of people who shared her twisted views about the necessity of breaking spirits in the name of salvation. History did not vindicate her. Instead, her name became synonymous with the abuse of power disguised as moral authority. The story of St. Helena's was taught in schools as an example of institutional failure. Laws bearing Catherine Brennan's name were passed in multiple states, requiring medical oversight of institutions that cared for minors. These were small victories in the larger struggle for human freedom and dignity. Each law passed, each investigation conducted, each instance of abuse prevented represented lives saved. Each person who learned about St. Helena's and resolved to be vigilant represented a small expansion of safety for vulnerable people. Margaret lived to be 73 years old, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1916, just as another generation was beginning to question authority and fight for freedom and rights in new ways. Her obituary in the New Orleans Times-Picayune listed her many accomplishments, her decades of advocacy, her impact on institutional reform throughout the South. But the line that would have meant the most to her was buried near the end of the article. A simple statement from a woman who had been one of the girls at St. Helena's, saved by Margaret's courage. Margaret Sullivan saved my life by refusing to accept suffering as inevitable or divinely ordained. She taught me that I did not have to accept abuse, that my body belonged to me, and that speaking truth was more important than maintaining comfort or avoiding conflict. She showed me what freedom really means, not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete reality that must be defended every day. I have tried to live by her example every day since that terrible time, and I hope I have succeeded in honoring her memory through my own resistance to injustice wherever I encounter it. That was the real legacy of St. Helena's, not the institution itself, but the resistance it provoked and the lessons learned by those who survived it. Freedom is not a gift bestowed by benevolent authorities. It is a right claimed by those brave enough to demand it, defended by those strong enough to protect it, and preserved by those wise enough to remain vigilant against those who would take it away.